In this video, we'll be talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and specifically our focus is on Volume 2 and chapters 1 through 4. So Volume 2, Chapter 1 opens up with Victor, and he's contemplating everything that's happened thus far. His brother William has been murdered. His family's friend and the caretaker for William, Justine Moritz, has been also killed as she's been tried by a jury and found guilty of William's murder and then hanged. Victor has put the pieces of this puzzle together, and he realizes that it was his actions, the creation of his monster, that led to these two deaths. So he feels this sense of remorse, depression, and he seeks out isolation. He's seized, he says, by remorse and by guilt, and it preys upon his mind. He tries to isolate himself from his family because he does feel guilty, and he doesn't reveal to them, though, why he feels guilty or why he's depressed. They just assume it's because, he's lost his brother. But they can't explain why he's, irrationally angry or is isolating himself so much. So they don't fully know the full story of why Victor is acting this way. Only he knows why he feels so guilty. And it's because he's let loose this creature, he says, amongst humanity. So even with Elizabeth, who he's, promised to marry in the future, sort of one of his closest allies or confidants, he doesn't reveal anything about what he's really feeling. He admits on page 120, he says, "I, not indeed, but in effect, was the true murderer." So he views himself as a murderer, even though he didn't do the physical acts of murder himself. He was the one who created the monster, and then the monster did the actual murders. But it was from his actions that these two innocent lives were destroyed. So all of chapter 1 of volume 2 is sort of dealing with Victor's mentality. At some points, he even sort of contemplates suicide, but he doesn't want to leave his loved ones exposed, vulnerable to this vengeful monster. He knows he has to take control of the situation in some way and make amends or find resolution between himself and the monster in order to redeem himself for what he's done. The question of ethics or morality is brought up in this part of the book. We have, Victor being a kind of morally ambiguous character. He doesn't, come forward and stand up and save Justine when she's on trial for murder. So he's kind of silent and complicit in her death. And his actions have also caused Elizabeth to question humanity and justice. She says, when I reflect on Justine Moritz's death, she says, men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood, because she sees the death of an innocent person. And she feels that all of humanity now, because Justine was wrongfully accused and executed as a murderer, Elizabeth has basically lost all faith in mankind. And she sees all humanity as having this propensity to violence and bloodlust. So in chapter 2, the family, the ones who remain, Victor's father, Ernest, Elizabeth, they all sort of seek out the source of nature as a way to sort of heal themselves and feel better about life in general. The role of nature played a very important role for the Romantic period in history. When I say romantics, I don't mean like love and romance. I'm talking about a specific period of art and history, cultural movement in the 18th century. So the Romantics were a group of artists, including, poets like Wordsworth, who wrote about the natural world and were inspired by the natural world and drew inspiration from nature. And it was their way of sort of contemplating the beauty and power of the natural world and almost worshiping nature as a kind of religion. And if we look at the role of nature in the novel, it does, like I spoke of in my last lecture, create a contrast between Victor's unnatural or scientific manipulations of nature, and it shows how unnatural the birth of this monster was by Victor's creation. So by contrast, the natural world is healthy and beautiful and healing, and Victor's scientific manipulations are unnatural, corrupt, and destructive, harmful. So we have this sort of push and pull between those two aspects of life, nature, and the unnatural use of science. So this is where Victor is finally confronted when he travels up to the very highest peaks of Mont Blanc, which is a mountain. And he goes to the very top, and then this is where he is finally confronted with his creature. So this is actually the first time that they are meeting sort of face to face since his creation, his birth. And that was, 2 years ago, I think, if we look at the timeline. So this is the confrontation that they finally have, and you get to see the anger and antagonism between creator and creation, parent, offspring, father, son, in this discussion. So immediately upon seeing, the creature reveals itself to Victor, and immediately he beholds its appearance and notes that, it has superhuman speed, that it's physically horrifying to behold. He talks about an unearthly ugliness, rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. He will also use various words or names to degrade the creature. So he'll call it vile insect, devil, demon. He doesn't give it a name, right? So it's always dehumanized as something other than human. The creature refers to Victor as his creator, or he says, my creator. And he feels like Victor has a duty towards him because he did not ask to be born. And Victor has taken this responsibility of creating this creature, but he immediately abandoned it. So the creature feels like Victor owes it something. So that's basically kind of the first confrontation between them. The creature asks Victor for some kind of help, support. He says, do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. So it's the creature itself is threatening Victor here and saying, if you don't comply with what I'm asking, I will be the source of death and bring blood and revenge upon you and all of your friends and family. So the creature is asking Victor to comply with these conditions and it'll become more apparent what those conditions are, what it's asking him for. But basically, he views Victor as owing him. As a creator, he needs to bestow some sense of duty or kindness or affection onto his offspring. Basically, he has been a neglectful parent and a neglectful father, and the creature is the product of this neglect. This is on page 126. So again, the creature is very eloquent. You know, he speaks very clearly. It's not the sort of monster monosyllabic grunts that we associate with the Frankenstein monster. He's very eloquent and, you know, has developed speech. So he says to Frankenstein, "Oh, Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous." So he is referring to a transformation that's occurred in his life. He says, "I was once born. When I was born, I was benevolent and good." He was a kind person. But misery has made me into a fiend. So this is kind of the villain origin story, so to speak, right? So it's explaining why he becomes such a vengeful, angry murderer. It's because of the misery that he has gone through in his life on Earth thus far. And he says, you know, "I will once again be virtuous if Victor goes through whatever conditions are necessary to make the monster happy." So it's kind of a threat and a little bit of a proposition, like, you do this for me and I'll do this back. I'll become a good person, or I'll leave humanity alone if you comply with these conditions. Victor, at first, he's repulsed and doesn't listen to the creature, but eventually he decides that he has to hear out the full story of what happened to the creature and at least get his side of the story. You also might notice there's a lot of biblical allusions in the monster's speech. So he refers to himself, he says, "I ought to be thy Adam," as in he's referring to Adam and Eve. God created humans. God created Adam and created Eve from Adam's rib. So the story goes. But he says, instead of being Adam, who God, took care of and created Eden for, he sees himself as the fallen angel. So instead he's more like Satan, full of sin and wrath and revenge. So these are sort of the biblical references that the author is using here. And these biblical references relate to ideas of, good and evil, and, morality and immorality that are part of the human experience. So chapter 3 is the start of the creature's story, sort of the story within the story, the inset story, where he tells his side of the story of how he was created and what he went through from his birth to the present moment. So he talks almost as if, it's as if he's describing what it's like being a baby or a child. And he says everything was first indistinct, all sort of sensations blurred together. He saw, felt, heard, smelt all at the same time. So he was just learning, gaining his senses when he was first created. And then he slowly sort of discovers parts of the natural world once he leaves Victor's apartment. He heads to the forest and he discovers fire, he discovers cold, he discovers the pleasure of sunlight and warmth. He finds food, edible berries and whatnot to eat. So it's very like subsistence in his early days of just learning how to face the world around him and gain all, human senses. He gradually becomes accustomed to the light and, figures out that he needs food, shelter, water, all those things that are necessities for human existence. Shelter, food. If we look at an example of sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's the physiological needs that are first necessities, the basic needs of all human life, to feel and to be supported. And food, water, warmth, and rest are the first things that the creature seeks out for itself. And it finds most of those, but they're very meager, right? He finds a small pigsty or a small hut in order to shelter himself off and find warmth and safety. His security and safety he finds that those things are denied him because of the way he looks. People who encounter him shriek and cry when they see him, and they start beating him or chasing him away. So when he seeks out other contact with human beings in the village, he can't achieve belongingness and love needs. He can't attain safety needs because he says he enters the village and he says, I had hardly placed my foot within the door before the children shrieked and one of the women fainted. The whole village was roused. Some fled, some attacked me, until grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons, I escaped to the open country and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel, quite bare, and making a wretched appearance after the palaces I had beheld in the village. So he discovers this is his first encounter with humankind, and it's very cruel. He's viewed as a monster, and the children and townspeople shriek and attack him because of the way he looks. So he's in his self-actualization of his hierarchy of needs. He's able to meet the basics, but he's not able to share in any love or companionship, sense of belonging with other human beings. And his safety is compromised when he enters into any human contact. So the theme of prejudice is very apparent in the monster's sort of origin story. He explains that he became violent and angry because he was rejected by humanity. And the rest of his story will also corroborate this idea of prejudice based on his physical appearance. But it seems as if he can't fit into the rest of humanity because of the way he looks. And he's rejected, shunned by the rest of society. And it's the thing he longs for is that sense of belonging, that sense of community, that acceptance, compassion, kindness, that he cannot get from others. He ends his chapter 3 where he finds this little hovel, a pigsty that's adjoined to a cottage, and that's where he's going to sort of live for the time being, almost like a subhuman creature, an animal, because he's not accepted into human society. So he can only look through the cracks of this dwelling where he's in the outside pigsty, and he can see through a crack into the cottage where he can observe the family that's living there. And as his story will go on, this is where he learns from this family the basic skills of being a human, including how to speak English or how to command language and how to read, and all of those sort of roles that he associates with human society.